Without further ado, let's explain the propulsion system of the UFO proposed by Bob Lazar. It's a fairly well accepted view that at least some UFOs use a gravity or anti-gravity propulsion system, and the Lazar UFO is no exception. In order to explain anti-gravity, I'm first going to explain a little bit about conventional aircraft. First of all, what is flying? Well, rather than consider flying, let's just consider getting off the ground, because the two are not the same. There are three different ways that we Earthlings have discovered that will get us off the ground and into the sky. The first method is the hot air balloon. This method relies on the fact that the air around us is a fluid which has mass. If we create an object which is on average less dense or lighter than the air surrounding it, then it will float above the surrounding air. The hot air balloon is essentially floating on the air in the same way that a plastic duck floats in the bath. This method of getting us off the ground is not really flying, but floating. The second method is what we would consider flying. The Wright Brothers achieved the first flight in 1903. And the difference between this and a balloon is that the plane is heavier than the air, whereas the balloon is not. Hence, the Wright brothers' aeroplane was not floating, but flying. Flight is achieved by the craft creating pressure underneath the wings due to the airflow above and below the wings causing lift. This is also true of a helicopter. When a bird flaps its wings, it creates the same effect. This is what we humans call flying. The third method that Earthlings have discovered is used by a space rocket or indeed by a firework. The upward thrust uses Newton's third law. By creating a force in a downward direction, an equal and opposite thrust is created in an upward direction, propelling the rocket. In this type of motion, we would not consider the craft to be flying. The first two methods discussed here would not work on the moon or on any planet that has no atmosphere. They rely totally on there being surrounding air to work. The third method would work without air, but requires lots of heavy fuel to eject out the back of the craft in order to project it off the ground. Of the methods mankind has discovered, two don't work in space, and the third requires lots of heavy fuel. Having considered these three methods, you now need to forget them. The UFO doesn't get off the ground using any of these techniques, and it certainly doesn't fly, float, or use thrust, but it does get off the ground, and I will explain how. We need to consider why things stay on the ground in the first place. We've all heard of gravity. In everyday physics, we know that a very large object, such as the Earth, attracts all other objects and causes them to accelerate towards it. We observe this when an apple falls from a tree. This pulling force is dependent on the weight or mass of the large object. All objects on Earth are actually attracted to each other by the same gravity, but the size of the force is so small you don't notice the attraction between objects, only towards the Earth. It's only when something becomes as large as the Earth that there is a significant pull. We should now consider why a large mass pulls all other masses towards it. To best describe the effect of gravity, it's easier to consider the universe as being two-dimensional. In other words, there is no up or down. The universe is just a flat surface. Consider placing the Earth in this two-dimensional universe. It bends the space around it. This bending of space is what a gravitational field is, except it works in three dimensions, which is impossible to picture in our mind, so we will continue to use two dimensions in this example. We can now place an apple in our universe, and as expected, it falls to the Earth. Let's put the apple back. Now consider for a moment how we could prevent the apple from falling to the Earth. Well, what if we created another distortion away from the Earth, just behind the apple, like so? The apple could then balance on the rim and would essentially just stay in mid-air. And this is how the UFO stays off the ground. It generates its own gravity well away from the Earth's, such that the two are cancelling out the effect of each other. This is why, when the UFOs hover, their motion is seen to be slightly unstable, because the propulsion system has to make constant corrections to keep the two balanced, a bit like balancing on a tightrope. Note that anyone inside a craft hovering in this fashion would be weightless, so the craft stays off the ground using a method unlike any conventional aircraft. It is in effect interfering with the thing that keeps us on the ground in the first place, gravity. Imagine then if we allow the apple to start to fall into the gravity well that it has created, but as it falls, then move the position of the well further from the earth. We could then make the apple move at incredible speed, and this is how the propulsion is achieved in an anti-gravity craft. So how on earth can these craft manipulate space in this way? How do they produce their own gravity? Well, according to Bob Lazar's explanation, the craft use a special chemical element called unpentium, or element 115, which is found at the very end of our periodic table. A small piece of the element is used at the heart of a gravity reactor. In this reactor, the element is bombarded with protons and very briefly is turned into element 116. This element does not exist for long, but when it does, emits a gravity wave, which is then focused using 3 gravity amplifiers housed in the belly of the flying saucer, which then produces the gravity wave, causing the distortion of space to propel the craft. The reactor also produces massive quantities of energy in an antimatter type nuclear reaction that is required to achieve the distortion of space. The UFO craft proposed by Bob Lazar uses a reactor with element 115 as its fuel to produce a gravity wave. When the craft travels long interstellar distances, it has a mode known as delta configuration. When the flying saucer travels in this mode, using 3 gravity amplifiers focused at a point in space, it travels at 90 degrees to the plane of the disk, not as you would see it in a science fiction film traveling sideways. This type of movement has been confirmed in many UFO sightings when the craft are seen to hover almost stationary, as I described earlier, then they shoot off vertically in the blink of the eye at impossible speed. This happened in 2006 in a very famous sighting at O'Hare International Airport. The UFO cut a perfect circle in the clouds as it departed vertically upwards. So if all this is true, how come we are not flying around in these flying saucers? Well, one reason is because element 115 does not occur naturally on Earth and has been brought here by aliens from other parts of our galaxy, so the magic fuel is not readily available. We have touched briefly on the propulsion system, but what about the flight control and navigation? As I mentioned earlier, Lazar stated a few years ago that these things still puzzled him. He claimed that there was a distinct lack of instrumentation within the craft. Other people who have witnessed the recovered Roswell UFO, such as Werner von Braun, are known to have said that the controls were in some respect biological, that the craft was connected to the alien's brain directly, and that flying the craft was more like playing the piano or playing a game of chess. If you're sitting thinking that all this is science fiction and that faster than light travel is science fiction, then think again. In 1996, theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre produced a remarkable paper which grew from his work in general relativity, which is the current standard model for space-time and gravitation. His paper describes a very unusual solution to Einstein's equations of general relativity, described in the title as a warp drive and in the abstract as a modification of space-time in a way that allows a spaceship to travel at an arbitrarily large speed. Alcubierre described in detail, along with all of the required mathematics, an explanation of how faster-than-light travel can be achieved. The proposal is very similar to the simplified explanation I gave earlier, but the principles are the same. The diagram here depicts Alcubierre's mathematical model, showing the distortion of space both in front and behind of the region of space in the middle, which travels faster than light. To put this simply, without going into all of the equations, the normal rules for the maximum possible speed of travel do not occur when you start bending space itself. The alien craft may not use the exact method proposed by Michael Alcubierre, but his work certainly lays to rest all of the claims from diehards who think that faster-than-light travel is not possible.